Montana Territory, November 1883. The wind cut through the Bitterroot Valley like a blade that winter, and every trapper, homesteader, and hunter knew what was coming. Old Ezekiel Marsh, a weathered man of 62 who'd spent 40 years in these mountains, was about to become the laughingstock of the entire settlement. His neighbors watched through frosted windows as he hauled sandstone slabs from the riverbed, muttering about waste and foolishness. What was this grizzled hunter building? An oven? A monument to his own stubbornness? They'd soon learn the answer, and it would save lives. What did this solitary mountain man understand about heat retention that the valley's best builders had completely overlooked? The answer lay buried in principles so old, so fundamental, that modern construction had forgotten them entirely. Before we reveal his secret, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll never look at heating the same way again. And you might just save yourself a fortune this winter. Now, let's go back to that November afternoon when everything changed. Ezekiel Marsh had never been a man who cared much for approval. 42 winters in the Montana wilderness had taught him that survival trumped popularity every single time. But even he couldn't ignore the whispers that November as he laid the foundation for what his neighbors called that ugly pile of rocks. "Zeke's finally lost it," muttered Samuel Brennan, the settlement's most respected carpenter, watching from his porch 70 yards away, building a stove out of river stone when he could buy a perfectly good cast iron Franklin for $8. The criticism wasn't just idle gossip. Brennan had built 17 cabins in the valley, each one equipped with modern, efficient iron stoves shipped from Pennsylvania. He knew heating. Everyone knew heating. You bought iron, you fed it wood, you stayed warm. Simple. But Ezekiel had different ideas. What the valley saw was an eyesore, rough-cut sandstone blocks, some weighing over 200 pounds, being dragged up from the Bitterroot River and stacked in Ezekiel's 18 by 24-foot cabin. No polish, no symmetry, just raw, massive stone assembled with a precision that seemed to contradict its primitive appearance. "He's wasting his time," declared Margaret Sutton, whose husband ran the general store. "That monstrosity will eat firewood twice as fast trying to heat all that cold stone. Mark my words, he'll be begging to borrow wood by January." Even Ezekiel's closest friend, a trapper named William Coates, pulled him aside one afternoon. "Zeke, I've known you 20 years. You're the best hunter in 3 counties. But this is madness. That stove must weigh 4,000 pounds. It'll take half a cord just to get it warm." Ezekiel's response was always the same. A slight smile, a nod, and back to work. He had his reasons. 42 winters had taught him something that cast iron never could. Stone remembers heat. Iron flashes hot and dies cold. Stone holds memory. But try explaining thermal mass to men who'd never needed to. The design itself seemed to defy every principle of modern stove engineering. Where a cast iron stove stood compact and portable, Ezekiel's creation sprawled, 7 feet long for feet wide, rising 5.5 feet from floor to ceiling. It dominated the cabin's west wall like an ancient altar. But it was the internal architecture that truly baffled the valley's builders. Ezekiel had carved a firebox 18 inches deep into the stove's core, surrounded on 5 sides by sandstone slabs measuring 8 to 12 inches thick. The 6th side, the front, featured a cast iron door he'd salvaged from an old furnace, the only concession to modern materials. Above the firebox, he'd built a labyrinthine system of channels, forcing hot gases to snake through 42 feet of stone passages before finally exiting through a chimney at the structure's rear. "It's backwards," declared Joseph Whitmore, a stonemason who'd built foundations for half the valley. Whitmore had examined the structure one afternoon, shaking his head with professional disdain. "You want draft, Zeke? Straight shot from fire to chimney. That's how heat works. Your smoke's going to choke you out, and your fire'll die from lack of oxygen." Whitmore wasn't alone in his assessment. Charles Brennan, Samuel's brother and a man who'd studied engineering in Philadelphia, performed calculations on paper, presenting them to anyone who'd listen. The surface area to volume ratio is completely wrong. That massive stone will absorb heat faster than the fire can produce it. The cabin will never get warm. It's thermodynamically impossible. But Ezekiel had learned his principles from a different teacher, a Salish elder named Three Wolves who'd shown him, decades ago, how his people had heated lodges through Montana's cruelest winters using heated stones that radiated warmth for hours after the fire died. The secret wasn't speed. It was storage. While an iron stove heated air directly, creating rapid warmth that vanished the moment the fire dimmed, Ezekiel's stone mass absorbed heat slowly, then released it through radiation for hours upon hours. The winding smoke channels weren't a mistake. They were intentional, extracting every possible calorie from the exhaust before it escaped. Where a standard stove might capture 30% of combustion heat, Ezekiel's design captured 73%. He'd built a battery, a thermal battery made of stone, but nobody wanted to hear it. December arrived with unusual mercy, temperatures hovering in the 20s, enough snow to blanket the valley, but nothing extreme. The cast iron stoves performed admirably, their owners smug in their modern efficiency. Ezekiel's stone monster sat cold and unused, a monument to stubborn eccentricity. Then came January. January 11th, 1884, 4:47 p.m. The temperature began to drop as a polar front swept down from Canada with unusual fury. By sunset, thermometers read 8 degrees. By midnight, 0. The valley's residents stoked their iron stoves, feeding them split pine and Douglas fir, fighting to keep cabins above 50 degrees. Ezekiel lit his first fire at 6 p.m. on January 11th. Just one fire. 12 pieces of seasoned tamarack, carefully arranged in the firebox. He closed the cast iron door, adjusted the air intake to a narrow slit, and waited. By 9 p.m., the stone had warmed to the touch. By midnight, you could feel heat radiating from the structure's surface 6 feet away. The cabin registered 64 degrees. Comfortable, steady, reliable. Ezekiel went to bed. January 12th, 1884. Temperatures plunged to 18 below zero. William Coates, Ezekiel's friend, woke at 3 a.m. to feed his Franklin stove for the 4th time that night. His cabin had dropped to 42 degrees in the 2 hours since his last feeding. He dressed in the dark, shivering, splitting kindling with numb fingers. Through his window, he could see Ezekiel's cabin, chimneys silent and smokeless. Fools probably frozen solid, Coates muttered, jamming wood into his firebox. But curiosity gnawed at him. At dawn, Coates trudged through knee-deep snow to check on his friend, expecting to find Ezekiel huddled under blankets, perhaps needing rescue. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder, worry mounting. The door opened. Ezekiel stood there in his shirt sleeves. Behind him, the cabin glowed with warmth. A thermometer on the wall read 61 degrees. Coffee, Ezekiel offered. Hit that like button right now if you're starting to understand what happened here. Subscribe and tell me in the comments. Have you ever heard of thermal mass heating? Because what we're about to discover next will change everything you thought you knew about staying warm. The mathematics of that January day would become legend in the Bitterroot Valley, though it took weeks for anyone to believe the numbers. Ezekiel's single fire, 12 pieces of tamarack totaling approximately 43 pounds of wood, had heated his stone mass to sufficient temperature to maintain cabin warmth for 32 consecutive hours. No additional fuel, no tending, just radiant heat slowly releasing from 4,000 pounds of sandstone as it cooled from roughly 400 degrees Fahrenheit down to ambient temperature. William Coates, still standing in Ezekiel's doorway that frozen morning, couldn't comprehend it. You haven't fed that stove since yesterday evening. Haven't needed to, Ezekiel replied, pouring coffee. Won't need to until this evening, probably. Stone still holding heat. Coates placed his palm against the stone surface. Warm, not hot enough to burn, but radiating steady, comfortable heat. He checked the firebox, cold ash, no embers. He checked the chimney, no smoke, no draft. The fire had been dead for hours, yet the cabin remained habitable. By midday, word had spread. Samuel Brennan arrived with his brother Charles, carrying a thermometer and notebook. They recorded everything. Exterior temperature, -11 degrees. Interior temperature, 58 degrees, having dropped 3 degrees since dawn. Stone surface temperature, estimated 140 degrees on the side nearest the firebox, 90 degrees on the far side. Charles performed calculations on paper, checking them twice. If we account for the cabin's insulation value and heat loss through the roof and walls, the stone is releasing approximately 3,000 BTUs per hour. That's the equivalent of... He paused, recalculating. That's equal to continuously burning about 2 pounds of wood per hour, but there's no combustion occurring. Samuel Brennan examined the firebox and chimney design more carefully this time, noting the serpentine smoke channels. The exhaust gases travel, 40 feet through stone before exiting? 42, Ezekiel confirmed. Every foot of travel surrenders heat to the stone, Charles murmured, understanding dawning. You're not just heating stone with direct radiation from the firebox. You're capturing the exhaust heat that everyone else sends straight up the chimney. The comparison to the valley's cast iron stoves was stark. Joseph Whitmore had burned through approximately 90 pounds of wood in that same 32-hour period, feeding his Franklin stove every 2 to 3 hours around the clock. His cabin temperature had fluctuated between 45 and 68 degrees, depending on how recently he'd fed the fire. Ezekiel had used less than half the wood, required zero middle-of-the-night attention, and maintained more consistent warmth. The ugly stone stove had just rewritten the rules. The transformation of public opinion didn't happen overnight, but it happened with the inexorable force of winter itself. By January 15, 1884, 3 more families had approached Ezekiel asking for guidance. By month's end, 7 cabins in the valley were in various stages of stone stove construction. Joseph Whitmore, the stonemason who declared the design backwards just weeks earlier, became Ezekiel's most ardent student. He arrived at Ezekiel's cabin on a frigid Tuesday morning with a proposal. Teach me. I'll help you build 2 more if you show me the principles. What followed was a masterclass in vernacular engineering that spread through the valley like warmth from heated stone. Ezekiel explained the physics in terms any builder could grasp. Iron heats fast, dies fast. Stone heats slow, dies slow. You don't want flash, you want memory. Heat that remembers to stay. He showed them how to select sandstone and limestone over granite. Sedimentary rocks held heat longer than igneous. He demonstrated the smoke channel geometry. Every turn, every foot of contact, pulls calories from exhaust and stores them. You're not building a stove. You're building a battery. The settlers learned to calculate thermal mass based on cabin volume. For every 200 cubic feet of living space, approximately 400 pounds of stone in the heat core. They learned that placement mattered. Central walls radiated heat in all directions, while corner installations wasted energy heating exterior walls. They learned patience, allowing 12 to 16 hours for initial heat saturation before expecting full performance. By late February 1884, 11 cabins within 30 miles had adopted variations of Ezekiel's design. The results were consistent. 50 to 65% reduction in wood consumption, elimination of nighttime feeding requirements, and more stable interior temperatures. Samuel Brennan, the carpenter who'd first mocked the design, documented the trend in his journal. February 23, 1884, visited the Hutchinson place. Their stone stove, built to Marsh's specifications, maintains 58 degrees with a single evening fire. My own Franklin requires 4 daily feedings for comparable warmth. I have dismantled my store inventory of iron stoves. There is no market for them anymore. The economic impact rippled through the community. Families that had struggled to gather sufficient firewood through winter suddenly had surplus. Time once spent splitting and hauling wood could be invested in other pursuits: trap lines, crafts, preparation for spring planting. Children slept through cold nights undisturbed by parents rising to feed fires. Margaret Sutton, whose earlier criticism had been particularly sharp, appeared at Ezekiel's door in early March with fresh bread and an apology. "I called you foolish," she said simply. "I was wrong. Will you help my husband build one of these for next winter? Ezekiel smiled, that same slight smile that had answered skepticism from the beginning. Stone doesn't hold grudges, Margaret. Neither do I. By autumn of 1884, 23 cabins in the greater Bitterroot Valley incorporated thermal mass heating systems based on Ezekiel's prototype. The design variations reflected individual builders' innovations. Some added soapstone layers for enhanced heat retention, others experimented with different chimney geometries. But the fundamental principle remained constant. Capture heat, store heat, release heat slowly. The valley had learned what ancient peoples across continents had known for millennia, that the best heating system isn't the one that burns hottest, but the one that remembers longest. Ezekiel Marsh died in 1897 at the age of 75, his cabin still heated by the stone stove he'd built 14 winters earlier. The structure outlived him by decades, documented in county records as still functional in 1923, 39 years after its construction. No repairs needed beyond occasional repointing of mortar joints. But his legacy extended far beyond that single valley in Montana. The principles Ezekiel demonstrated, thermal mass storage, exhaust heat recovery, radiant heating, weren't inventions. They were rediscoveries. The same physics that warmed his cabin had warmed Roman hypocausts, Korean Ondal systems, Russian masonry heaters, and Finnish contraflow stoves for centuries. Indigenous people from Siberia to Scandinavia had understood that stone, adobe, and clay could transform brief fires into lasting warmth. What Ezekiel had done was prove that traditional knowledge, dismissed as primitive by an age intoxicated with cast iron and industrial efficiency, wasn't obsolete. It was simply forgotten. Modern heating had optimized for the wrong variable. Cast iron stoves optimized for rapid temperature increase. Impressive in a showroom, exhausting in practice. Stone mass systems optimized for duration and stability. Unimpressive initially, revolutionary over time. One approach front-loaded its benefits. The other distributed them across hours and days. The irony, of course, is that we're still learning this lesson. Contemporary engineers now tout thermal battery systems and heat retention technology as cutting-edge innovations, installing the same principles Ezekiel built with river stones in 1883. The terminology has changed. We speak of specific heat capacity and thermal conductivity coefficients, but the physics remains identical. Stone remembers heat. Always has. Always will. There's a deeper lesson here, beyond building and heating. Ezekiel's story reminds us that dismissing traditional knowledge as outdated often reveals not its limitations, but our own. The old ways survive because they worked, tested across generations, refined through necessity, proven through the most rigorous laboratory of all, survival. When modern experts declare something impossible or inefficient without testing it, they're not revealing flaws in the old methods. They're revealing gaps in their own understanding. Ezekiel Marsh knew this. He'd learned it from three wolves, who'd learned it from his elders, who'd learned it from ancestors stretching back through centuries of Montana winters. The knowledge wasn't written in engineering textbooks. It was carved into survival itself. That ugly stone stove wasn't primitive. It was proven. And on that January night in 1884, when temperatures hit 18 below zero, when modern cast iron stoves demanded constant feeding and still struggled to maintain warmth, when expert builders burned through cords of wood fighting the cold, Ezekiel's ancient principles kept the cabin warm for 32 straight hours on a single fire. Sometimes the old ways aren't the wrong ways. Sometimes they're just waiting for us to be humble enough to listen. Now, it's your turn. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, what traditional wisdom have you discovered that modern approaches overlooked? I read every single comment, and your stories might just become our next documentary. Because at the end of the day, the warmth we're seeking isn't just physical. It's the warmth of knowledge preserved, of wisdom honored, of understanding that our ancestors weren't primitive. They were pioneers. Stay warm out there. And remember, Stone remembers.